but but they claim that it is. So I guess we missed the beginning of this. But they claim that it is so that they can mobilize the protection from harm argument. Now, if we agree that racist content is harmful, then not publishing these 6 books is protection from harm, which is a culturally accepted form of censorship. And I should say that they're not published anymore, but they still exist. They're still in lots of libraries. I checked all these stats before I came out, and that should say actually not April 2021, but it should say October 2024. I updated a graphic because I just checked that today. Another argument that is made is that we should offend everyone equally. But the notion of offending everyone equally is a false equivalency. It doesn't take into account the unequal distribution of power. So the most obvious example is that there is no N word for white people. I mean, I'm a white man, you can certainly offend me, but you can't use language, art, culture, history to dehumanize me. But you can very much marshal language, art, culture, history to dehumanize women, LGBTQIA people, people of color. So it's actually impossible to offend everyone equally. People will also say, well, the left and the right both want to ban books, but for different reasons. And that too is a false equivalency. Those different reasons really matter, right? In the US, liberals want to protect children from racist books, while conservatives want to protect children from learning that racism exists. And liberals tend to think that sex education is a good idea, but conservatives want to protect children from learning how human reproduction works. Those are not morally equivalent positions. So finally, I just want to say that, it's okay to have complicated relationships with your childhood favorites. In fact, it's really healthy to have complicated relationships with your childhood favorites. Though I'm known for calling out the racism in Seuss's works, I'm also a scholar of Seuss and think fondly of many of his works. I remember at age 3 reading Green Eggs and Ham and so enjoying the experience of reading this book. The next thing I did was read it again. So it's the first book that I read all by myself, and it's the first book that I reread. And incidentally, though I don't think it was Seuss's intent, it's also a Seuss book with an ambiguously gendered protagonist. We are never told whether the Sam in Sam I Am is Samantha or Samuel. There's never a pronoun used, and the character's outfit, a dress and a floppy hat, just does not resolve that question. So, sure, you might skip or at least change your approach to a book like If I Ran the Zoo, but there remain plenty of Seuss books that people can feel comfortable reading with children, Green Eggs and Ham, Lorax, Fox and Socks. And also, there's just a wealth of excellent books that have been published in the last, the 33 years since Dr. Seuss died. So we can read those instead of or in addition to these Seuss books. So that's my 5 minutes, 6 minutes. I realized the beginning of this wasn't recorded, so someone stumbling upon this missed the opening, but that's it. And I will stop to share. So whoever wants to go next can go next.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Philip now. Now we're going to go to a few student speakers. Before we do so, I'm also going to share my screen, and I gave everybody the link to the presentation. So if you check your Zoom chat, you can click on the link yourself. Okay, I'm going to share the screen now. I think that's... okay. Okay, so welcome to today's forum on Dr. Seuss, whether and how students should read controversial books. So controversial books include Dr. Seuss. This was a controversial image. But then, as we know, it's not just it's not just controversial books that include Dr. Seuss, especially here in Orange County. Other books are maybe controversial as well, such as Heather Has Two Mommies, Daddy's Roommate. And so let me read a statement from Dr. Seuss Enterprise. So for Dr. Seuss' birthday, Dr. Seuss Enterprises celebrates readings and also our mission with messages of hope, inspiration, inclusion, and friendship. To this end, Dr. Seuss Enterprises, working with a panel of experts, made the decision last year to cease publication and licensing of the following 6 titles. And so I'm going to ask the audience members, including my student speakers, 2 questions. One is, do you agree that the Dr. Seuss books, such as Mulberry Street, portray people in hurtful and wrong ways? Do you agree with the publisher? And number 2 is, how should students read books that some claim are harmful? Okay, and so I'm going to go to the student speakers. Do we have Aaron here today? Aaron, are you here?
Yep, hello.
Okay,
Yeah.
Aaron, go ahead and introduce yourself.
So my name is Aaron Han. I'm a sophomore at Mirada High School. And I personally don't find any offense in the way that Dr. Seuss's controversial books portrays characters. And not only have I went around and asked those in my community, but going back to when I was a child, I remember reading Dr. Seuss stories because of its fun rhymes, the illustrations, and back then I would not have noticed the image of being a way to harming a certain ethnic group if it wasn't pointed out to me. And I feel like children won't really notice these books either, or even take them as a way to harm someone else unless it's pointed out by an adult. And I could understand why some people may think that these certain racial portrayals may be hurtful. But to me, it's just another children's book that's aiming to spark imaginative ideas out of children, which I support.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. Our next speaker is Gerald Han. Gerald, go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name is Gerald. I go to Sunny Hills High School in Fullerton, California, and I'm a sophomore. Okay, so first, when I was a kid, my favorite book from Dr. Seuss, and one of my favorite books actually in general, was uh, the Mulberry Street book from Dr. Seuss, which I actually really enjoyed as a kid. And the reason why Dr. Seuss Enterprises actually decided to remove that from publication was because of a single like a single picture, like a drawing of a Chinese man or an Asian man holding chopsticks. And as a kid back then, I don't think I even um saw this like outward, because to me it was just another wacky figure, or like another wacky character in the book, like any wacky character that can see on any page of the book, right? So to me as a kid, I thought it was just, oh, okay, it's just another cool character. But now that I understand that it's a racial stereotype, I don't think we should ban these type of books, but instead we should preserve these books, because uh, preventing other kids like myself in the past from reading these type of books doesn't get us anywhere. And actually keeping these books, instead of outright just stopping them from publication or preventing them from school libraries and like removing them from school libraries, that actually doesn't help anyone, because by reading these books, we can actually use these books as like a learning moment, or like a learning lesson, because by analyzing these books and teaching, oh, this book contained this potentially racist element, we can understand what to avoid in the future, what we can avoid doing in the future. For example, we can learn to avoid drawing any stereotypical characters in the future, and how that actually can be used as an educational experience. But also as a kid, I actually wish I read more controversial books like Mulberry Street. Like, for example, Daddy's Roommate or Heather Has Two Moms. I wish I read those books more as a kid, because back then I didn't really know actually queer books or queer literature at all. And I wish back then, if I knew more about it and read this type of literature more, I could have understood it better now and had a better perspective, better understanding of queer literature and how it has an effect on our society, and how LGBTQ things, or LGBTQ people, are being represented more in society. I could have learned better if I read it earlier as a kid. So looking back, I wish I read these books more to develop my perspective better now. And I think that's it for me. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Gerald. Our third and final speaker is Gabrielle Park. Gabriel, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Gabrielle Park, and I'm an eighth grader at Oxford Academy in California. So as a child, I grew up reading If I Ran the Zoo and On Beyond the Zebra, and I had so much fun. Yes, now I realize that the language is a little outdated, but Dr. Seuss wrote the books with a good intention. And I think it would be wrong to ban or cease the publication of these books because so many future children can enjoy them. Additionally, I believe that the government should revise copyright laws and automatically allow permanently out-of-print books to enter the public domain. After the publisher decided not to publish those six books anymore, many of them ended up on Amazon's bestsellers list with sky-high prices. Many Americans still want to read Dr. Seuss's books, but it's going to be more difficult as the supply dwindles. As long as Americans want to read those books, the government should allow us to do so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ellie. And then our final speaker is Professor Zimmerman. And he said, like, because of his last name, he's always used to being last. My last name is Y, so I can relate. Okay, go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, first of all, thanks to Joseph for bringing us all together, and thanks especially to the students for your comments, which I really appreciated. I also want to give a very big shout out to Phil Nell, who I've never met, but whose work I've admired over the years. And it's an honor to be on the same Zoom with him and with all of you. There are a lot of things Phil said I agree with, and a lot of things that I disagree with. So, in the spirit of comity, let's start with the ones I agree with. The ones I strongly agree with are the comments about the weakness of, the defense. That's what people thought back then. I'm a historian, and that makes me crazy. People will say, well, you don't like slavery, but that's what people thought back then. And to Phil's point, the question is which people? Certainly a lot of white people, that would be accurate, not all, right? William Lloyd Garrison didn't think slavery was great. But most of all, enslaved people didn't think slavery was great, right? Frederick Douglass did not think slavery was great. So the weakest defense you can make of any text, or really any idea, right, is precisely that. That's what people thought, because to Phil's point, it elides, the question of which people we're talking about. The second thing I agree with him up to a point is that Dr. Seuss has not literally been canceled. He's right about that. You could go and get a Dr. Seuss book right now in most parts of the free world. But I think here's where we start to disagree. He's right technically, right? But you could also say the book American Dirt has not been canceled. You could say Robert Mapplethorpe's paintings have not been canceled. You could say The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn or To Kill a Mockingbird have not been canceled. And you could say the books of Salman Rushdie have not been canceled, because all of those books are also available again in the free world. But the reason I raise those examples is that all of those books have been framed in different ways as harmful. Just like Phil said, Dr. Seuss's books are harmful. And they may be to some people in some circumstances. I don't doubt that. But I am terrified, literally terrified, by the idea of using that rubric to decide what, should be acceptable for people to read and think about. Think about the example of Salman Rushdie. I would argue that Salman Rushdie is the greatest purveyor of hate speech on the planet. I want to be clear that I do not personally believe that Salman Rushdie engages in hate speech, but I believe I could show you that millions, perhaps tens or hundreds of millions of people believe that, do not want his books in print, moreover, want him dead for writing those books. So has Salman Rushdie been canceled? Not literally, to Phil's point, right? But at the same time, I think there have been serious inhibitions and informal prohibitions placed on the circulation of his ideas. And like all forms of censorship, it proceeds from the idea that somebody's going to be harmed, and also that they're going to share whatever nefarious interpretation you have attributed to that text. That's what censors always do. They say someone's going to be harmed, and then they deny the idea that different people of equal knowledge and understanding and goodwill could in fact interpret the same text differently. And I think this is really where Phil and I disagree quite strongly. I'm a liberal with a small L. And what that means is, like Learned Hand, who's the most important jurist that was never on the Supreme Court, I believe in the spirit of liberty. And in 1944, a learned hand gave a famous talk with that title, where, by the way, he was swearing in new Americans, which is really important too, in Central Park, of all places, in New York City. He says, "What's the spirit of liberty?" And his answer is really short. The speech is like 2 minutes long. His answer is this: the spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not too sure of itself. And I'm a lot less sure about all these things than Phil now. You know, he in his I thought quite effective talk, he imagined this plurality between the good censors and the bad censors. And the good censors are the ones who want to get rid of this really harmful racist stuff. And the bad censors are the ones who want to blanket over racism. Are there people that like want to blanket over racism? Oh, hell yeah. Yeah, I can identify them for sure, right? But I'm not as sure as Phil is. I don't think the good guys and the bad guys are nearly as clear. And it would seem to me, since he referenced Moms for Liberty, at a time when Moms for Liberty is using the harm argument to say, you know, try to remove Toni Morrison's Beloved, well, you know, maybe those of us who thought we should get rid of The Adventures of Huck Finn because it contains the N-word, maybe we should rethink that. Maybe you can make an argument for why it's bad for the good burgers of Loudoun County to cancel Beloved, but it was good to cancel Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I can't make that argument, all right? But I'd be eager to hear somebody who does. So thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Philip, do you want to do a quick response before we do a general Q&A with the audience? Okay, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to thank all of the students for their contributions to the discussion. I've been taking notes as I've been listening to everyone. And I guess for a pretty quick response to Jonathan or to everybody, to John, because I also really enjoyed the way that Jonathan laid out the argument too. I thought that was really effective, and I liked. Yeah, I liked the sort of the kind of Socratic approach of it. I thought that was really effective. And I would agree. I mean, I think there are another area in which we agree, just to begin there, is I don't think we should be banning books either. And I'm not actually arguing for banning books. What I am arguing is that there's not a kind of moral equivalence that we can make between Heather Has Two Mommies and a Dr. Seuss book, right? That's what I'm arguing. And Jonathan says, well, that's, you know, good censors versus bad censors. I don't think the difference is as clear. But I would argue that the Moms for Liberty's misappropriation of harm is the issue, not harm. Harm is real, but they've misappropriated it for their own terms. Although I would agree in the effort to kind of complicate the good versus bad. I think that's actually a really good point and also really pertinent to a discussion of Dr. Seuss, because he is someone who tried to write fables that he intended as anti-racist fables, right? You know, he has the Sneetches, he has Horton Hears a Who, right? So, and he's doing those at the very same time that he's recycling racist caricature in his work, right? And If I Ran the Zoo or Scrambled Egg Super. So the kind of the good versus bad of it, or the, you know, you're either racist or anti-racist. No, actually, people are often both. And so I think that's a place where I sense we also intersect. And one of my problems with the discourse around Seuss is people are like, oh, he's a racist. Well, yeah, but like I also grew up on planet Earth in America and not on Mars. So, you know, my brain has also been influenced by the culture in which I live. And it's sort of, it's too easy for just to sort of say, well, he's a racist, don't read him, you know. And this actually reminds me of some of a few folks said, the students said, well, you know, as a kid, I didn't notice the stereotype. And I think kids wouldn't notice the stereotype. I think you're right. But then I also think about, what are all the images and ideas that live in your head that you're not aware of? And I think that's true for Seuss, right? Like, I don't think he intended to reproduce these racist stereotypes. In fact, I'm sure he didn't. But he grew up in a culture where that was just totally normal, right? And so it comes out in his work. And so I think things that you're not aware that you've learned, you have learned them, and so that is the issue for me on like, well, kids aren't going to notice. Maybe not, but that doesn't mean they're not learning. We absorb racist images and ideas often without our awareness and without our consent. So that would be my counter to that. Yeah, I think that's would be my response. But really enjoyed what Jonathan had to say and what all the students had to say, and I also really appreciate the spirit of debate, um, because it is a debate. And when I teach this in my classes, I don't come out as hard as I did at the beginning. I don't come out hard at all. I just ask a bunch of questions because that's not my job as a teacher. If I'm speaking in public, well, then I'll be different. I'll kind of make an argument. But in a class, no, I mean, I think you should arrive at your own decision, and there isn't one right answer. I taught a whole course on censorship, and that was kind of the point, to think about what it means and different ways in which it operates. So anyway, thanks. I have spoken too much. I will put mute on so that I can't say anything else. That will stop me. For now, will stop me for now.
Philip, don't mute yourself yet. Before we do the general Q&A, I just wanted a quick clarification. So Philip's saying he's opposed to banning. Do you have a stance on the publisher not publishing the 6 books anymore? Did you like support that, publicly oppose that, or were you just neutral on that?
I mean, I publicly supported it. And I really like the argument that was made about letting them go into the public domain. I think that was a powerful idea because then the publisher would not be profiting from it, right? I mean, and so that would be a strong argument or a strong counter argument to the position that I took. Copyright law doesn't work that way, so they're not going to be in the public domain. But I think that is a strong counter argument. But yeah, I mean, I guess for me, what to do with these books is not to take them out of your libraries, is not to throw them away, is not to sell them for jacked up prices on eBay either, but to keep them. As let's see, I wrote down everybody's things here. I think it was Gerald who said this, right? That that we could use them to learn from them. Yeah, I would agree with that. But you're gonna want some scaffolding around that, right? So I wouldn't sort of put them with the rest of the children's books, right? I would keep them in the library, but I would also, want to make sure that there was some guidance that was available as well.
Yeah, that gets me nervous.
So
It just gets me nervous. It just sounds a lot like Moms for Liberty to me. It's just like, okay, we'll let you have genderqueer, but it's got to be in this special part of the library, right? You have to have permission. It's in a dangerous area, right? We're marking it, that just makes me really nervous. I just don't trust. I don't have as much trust in authority, I think, because I'm a liberal, I don't have enough trust in us as a people to make these kinds of determinations like, ooh, which part of the library do we put the kind of dangerous books in? I do, however, have trust in the citizenry. I really do. I don't have trust in the government, but people are going to read this shit the way they read it. And nobody knows more about Seuss than Phil Neff. And so he may well disagree with the way that some people read Seuss, but they're going to read it their way, man. Right? And they're going to find things in it that maybe he didn't even know about. And I don't want anyone, a librarian or a teacher, to say, okay, we're going to keep it in the library, but it goes over in that scary, dangerous place. That makes me scared and makes me feel endangered.
Okay, that reminds me of the forbidden book section in Hogwarts, right? Harry Potter. Brandon also had a comment he wrote, but he was too shy to say this aloud. He was wondering about labeling. Okay, so his take might be that parents also have rights, and so maybe in San Francisco, Dr. Seuss books would be considered offensive to many parents. But here in Orange County, where many of the students come from, the header book would be very controversial. And so the question is, do parents have a right to know what books may offend their values in the school library? Do you see? And so what do you think about labeling, Jonathan and Philip? Do you think, is that okay? or at least a parental notification that certain books may be
my
offensive to their
basic
values.
take on this is parents do have a right to control as best they can what their kids who are minors do in every realm, right? When you're a minor, you are under the control of your parents. Now, your parents can't do anything, right? And we can all name things that are illegal for parents to do. But parents are the primary moral authority of their children. However, even though they do have a right to control or try to control what their own kids read, they have no right, zero, to control what somebody else's kid reads. So if you don't want your kid reading genderqueer, as sad as I find this, I do think you have a right to prevent her or him from reading genderqueer. I do not believe you have the right to prevent anybody else from reading it.
Okay, so I think to summarize what you're saying, so maybe we should not label the books, but the school should at least maybe send a newsletter to the parents saying that, these are the books in the library and, these books may, some parents find these books offensive. So just to, just kind of like FYI for your information. Would that be okay, at least a newsletter? Or do you think that's too stigmatizing?
Here's what I will say. I would not be pleased about the newsletter.
Okay.
But I would, although again, I've had some very smart people disagree with me about this. I would allow the school library to keep a list of books private with a list of parents that have said they don't want their kid taking out that book. So to me, that's different from the newsletter, right? Because I don't want there to be a public proclamation about what the dangerous books are. But I do think it's fair to say that if you're a taxpayer and a parent and a citizen, if your 8-year-old wants to take out a book that you disagree with, I think it would be okay for the school librarian to have a list of parents who don't want this book taken out, because that doesn't prevent anybody else from taking out the book.
Okay, so maybe not a newsletter, but at least a list that parents can access on their own, maybe on the website.
Yeah, and I understand the argument against that. The argument against that is very powerful, especially if you're talking about books around LGBTQ themes, right? Because the argument against that goes like this. Look, the parent is actually harming the child by preventing the child from exploring those sorts of questions, which might be deeply connected to the kid's identity. And it's precisely those kids that need to be exposed to a book like Genderqueer. And look, I think that's a strong retort. But at the same time, if like me, you're distraught by the poor state of public education, and if like me, you want citizens to pay more for it, I think you've got to be pretty careful around these questions. And you can't say, all right, Mr. or Ms. Parent, we're not going to let you prevent your kid from taking out genderqueer, even though it runs counter to all of your values. But could you please vote for more money in the new bond issue for the school district? That's going to be a pretty tough argument to make.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Now I'm going to open up to the whole audience. So who wants to have a question or comment? Okay, so raise your hand or tell me, or just yell at me. Do you guys have a question or comment? Can you come out one by one? This is your one chance to talk to the authors of the class readings. Yeah, your articles are signed mandatory readings for this week.
Okay. The only time anybody reads anything I write is when it's mandatory.
Oh, yes.
Nobody does it voluntarily.
Yeah, okay. Why don't you come up? Also, I see people in the audience like Jacob Kang, and then this Francis, Joey. Okay, so if you guys want to speak, Myungjun San, you're all welcome. Okay. I think you have something to say. Okay, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hello.
Okay, go ahead. Your name, where you're from.
My name is Julia. I'm from Spain. And hello. So I agree. Why do I hear myself? Oh, no. I agree with Jonathan's point of view mostly. And I mean, I would hate it for people to determine what's good and bad, even politics and socially and everything. So I think it's also the narrative that the government wants to imply on the people. So we've also studied many examples of political banning of social media comments or of riots that are determined like terrorist, and then others defending the peace or like stuff like that. So I feel like by banning books, you're banning a point of view and you're banning the education that comes from the learning that you experience with books. And also I understand the point that racism is different from like gender, or like the two mummies have, I don't know what the name is of the book, but I understand the difference. But I also understand that by educating people that that was bad, and then moving forward from that is the only way you can not, like you can make history not repeat itself. Because if we don't learn it, we're banned to repeating it. So that's my point. And but yeah, I also, the point that Philip made about just saying that it was how people thought back then, it is something that I thought about, like my argument, but I understand why it's not a strong argument. I understand why it's very weak. And but I do understand how educating people of how different minds work now and how different acceptance is now relevant is also a way to move forward in our society. So that's my comment.
We have another student with a question and comment. Go ahead.
Oh dear.
Okay, introduce yourself and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Aliyah from Germany. So I think I would mainly agree with Philip because personally speaking, from my experience, we read kind of books were kind of controversial considering their portrayal of Africans. And I'm from African descent, also going back a lot. Like I'm going back to Ivory Coast. That's where my parents are from. And actually, for me, it has been like a bad experience because it actually taught my classmates about the racial stereotypes, and they would use it against me. I was the only Black person in my class.
What grade was this?
It was mainly elementary school. And although the teacher would be like, oh, it's really bad, like Africans are actually not like this. My, how to say, my classmate would actively use it. They didn't know about the stereotypes and then they would use it. It was that bad that, that my mom has to be involved in this because they would say like, oh, you're adopted, your parents died in civil war, your hunger and poverty. And I have the feeling that these stereotypes are even going more. They didn't know about this and suddenly they knew about it. And I can see about my younger siblings, they still using that because people are using those books. I don't say you should have banned them necessarily. You can do some disclaimers, but currently there are like better books you could read about certain things. So yeah, I think that's.
I'd be curious, what were the books that the class read that exposed them to these stereotypes?
So it's mainly like German books from
Mhm.
like the Brother Grimm's. It sounds very stupid in English, but we have some German books where they're, for example, like, oh, all Africans are poor, or all Africans die in civil wars. And me being the only Black person, I'm actually mixed. So when they saw me as the Black person, they'd be like, oh, how can you walk around with a Middle Eastern mom? You adopted, they die in civil war, you guys are poor. And before that, they just saw me as just like, oh, the African kid, but suddenly they start doing the sounds which were interpreted in the book, like the monkey sounds. I was just like, okay.
See, to me, that's an argument for more information, right? It's not an argument to censor anything. It's an argument to inform.
Well, yeah, and
Obviously in the West, there have been across time since the era of slavery, horrible, horrible stereotypes and myths about people of African descent. And, if you're a historian, you spend a lot of your time reading about that because that's a part of our history. It's a part of our culture. But it seems to me the answer to that is always to add. It is never to subtract. Censors want to subtract. Educators want to add. The stereotypes are there. They're a part of our history, but they're not the only part of our history. There have been lots of good faith efforts to correct stereotypes and to expand and broaden our understanding of the African continent and of people of African descent. And it strikes me that, I don't know the circumstances of your class or who the teachers were or what the school was, right? But, my questions would be like, what other information and what other perspectives did the teacher try to introduce? And if the answer is none, that's the problem. That's the problem.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for sharing that. That's really hard to go through that. And it's really hard to go through that like all the time, like every time you show up at school. It's hard in ways that I cannot know or imagine, since those don't, like, I am never the target of bigotry or sexism or anything. And I think that while I think Jonathan and I overlap in the sense that I'm really not arguing for banning things, but I really would want a child to know that the book she were picking up was full of stereotypes. And if she wants to read it, I think she has the right to read it. But I think it's a little irresponsible to leave something harmful out and not let somebody know about it. Should they be forbidden from reading it? No, actually. And what I would want to make a case for, and what I think really should be part of this discussion, is children's rights. The United States is the sole country not to sign on to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that's not to say that this is a document that has, been upheld by all its signatories at all, right? It has not, right? But the US doesn't even aspire to the notion that children have rights. And I think they do have rights. And some of those rights, include freedom of expression, freedom of information, the right to diverse national and international media. And I'm quoting from this here, especially those promoting social, spiritual, and moral well-being. Freedom from harm is part of the rights of the child. So what I would argue for is actually not parents' rights, but children's rights. I think politically, you have to take an approach like Jonathan's, in the sense that, well, parents have a role. They're the voters, and they should be allowed. But I don't think parents are qualified, frankly. Most of violence and harm happens in the home, right? That's where it happens, not out in the world to children. So the kind of notion that parents are going to be the guardians of children isn't really supported by the evidence. Politically, I don't think you can make that argument, right? But factually, well, it's true. So what I would argue would be for children's rights. And that would be that I think is the path forward. And I would agree with Jonathan that children should actually have the right to check out what they want, provided somebody says, hey, you can check this out, but this is why we put it on this shelf, right? You can check it out, and you don't actually need your parents' permission to do that, but here's why it's over here, just so you know. And that would be my recommendation, because as was pointed out in the discussion, and as a point that I raised as well, there's a difference between racist stereotypes and saying that trans people are people. Those are very, very different.
Okay.
And I don't think we can kind of collapse that and say, well, both are controversial. Yeah, but for very different reasons. Trans people are people, period. And that's not actually a point of debate or argument. And it needs affirmation, and also needs affirmation that people of African descent are fully human. That needs affirmation through the culture, through the context, that Jonathan says, right? There need to be more context in that class.
Right.
And that's really, really, really different than like stuff that hurts people.
Again, I think there are some differences and some overlaps here, right? I don't think these two claims are similar at all, and I agree with Phil on that. But on the trans question, I do think that there are a number of very debatable propositions around trans rights and trans people that reasonable people disagree with. Like, for example, should trans women compete on female sports teams? I've heard good and bad arguments on that subject. And because I teach at the University of Pennsylvania, I've heard a lot of those arguments because, of course, we had a very successful swimmer, trans woman swimmer on the female team, who, broke a couple NCAA records. I don't know her. I have a lot of admiration for her. I think she's an incredibly brave and strong human being. But I've also heard some good feminist arguments from other women athletes and sometimes from other trans female athletes about how Leah Thomas's, 20 years living as a man gave her an unfair advantage. And so, like, I take Phil's point, trans people are people. I think I just made that same point. But again, I'm not as sure as he is about what's right and wrong in these realms. And I think, the trans athlete thing is a really good example. Where I work, most of my colleagues think that anybody who questions whether Leah Thomas should have been on the female team is a transphobe. I will acknowledge that some of those people absolutely are transphobes, for sure, like the people that call her Liar Thomas. But if that's the case, if everyone who opposes her be on the female team, how do you explain like those trans female runners who said that they didn't think that she should be on the team? Are they transphobes too? So I didn't mean to go into the weeds on that. I'm just trying to give an illustration, I think, of how difficult so many of these questions are. And at the end of the day, that's really the argument for freedom. The argument against censorship is that we can't explore these complexities if we're removing things from discussion. And I do think that that's a good example. Where I work, it has essentially been removed from discussion. And that seems to me deeply antithetical to both education and to freedom.
Trans women are women, so yeah. And I mean, Michael Phelps has double jointed elbows, and he has really large hands, he has a really long wingspan. I mean, you can have physical differences that give you particular talents, and that doesn't disqualify you. And the notion that trans athletes are somehow unfairly competing, I think is a lot of it's inherently transphobic, period. Trans women are women.
There's nothing to talk about.
And J.K. Rowling and all that crowd, yeah, I don't find that persuasive.
There's nothing to discuss.
Anyway, let's move on. I see a couple of hands, but before we do so, I just wanted to build on what Aliyah said. I was wondering what the speakers thought about well-intentioned but very ineffective teachers, right? So Aliyah had a teacher who wanted to kind of critically discuss like African stereotypes in a book in elementary school, but I think maybe the teacher was well-intentioned, but she was not effective. And so the students kind of weaponized the book to, psychologically harm Aliyah, right? So what do you do about those well-intentioned but terrible teachers or just ineffective teachers, right? And then do you think she should not have taught that book in the first place? Or do you think just maybe a better teacher might have been better? Or
well,
your thoughts?
I think you need training, right? So, I mean, I absolutely think you can use books with stereotypes in them educationally, but you can't just sort of imagine that, well, I'm a teacher, I can figure it out. I think you really need to be trained in anti-racist education for that. So I think that's the problem. It's actually harder than it looks to use racist books for anti-racist education. I think you can, and I have argued that you can, but it's not sort of a given that people will arrive in the room and kind of have the facility and to talk about that would be my answer to that. I know Jonathan may have a response, and I see also Frances has her hand up there too. So
okay,
yeah,
you want to respond?
I think Frances wants to talk first.
Okay, okay, Frances, go ahead, and then Aliyah will speak. Frances, on. Introduce
Hello,
yourself.
okay, I've unmuted again. Okay, so yeah, I'm Frances. I'm from I recently graduated from the University of Western Australia, and I'm actually 27, so I'm a little bit distant from some of this discussion. My question is, I feel that there seem to be two different sorts of streams that the argument is following. So one argument seems to be whether the books should be there at all in the library for just any kid or anyone to pick up, versus whether the book should be taught in the class. And the reason I bring up that distinction is because where I diverge with Jonathan a little bit is, while I agree that, you know, as imperfect as the model might be, the parents are the moral authority when the child is that age and should be able to dictate what that child reads, then it becomes more difficult in a classroom setting where you have, you know, the class of students, the teacher picks a book, and then you can't really have certain kids in the class have to sit out of that discussion or anything like that. So do you think the rules are slightly different for which books are actively highlighted by the teacher? Who, I guess there could be two arguments made in that you could, on one hand, you could say, oh, the teacher can, you know, critically discuss the book. And I do remember in, you know, even when I was quite young in primary school, then we had a teacher who talked through picture books in a very analytical and thoughtful way, but in a way that was very accessible to even very young students. But then it could also be the case, like the one Elia was bringing up, where the teacher tried to analyze or talk about African stereotypes, but then the other students weaponized it. So yeah, my basic question is, do you think the rules are different for whether the book is just there existing in the library versus whether the book is highlighted in an educational syllabus?
I think
Should we bring Maya back into this before we
let's
talk?
first
Sorry,
hear
go
from
ahead.
Elia.
Oh, please,
Elia,
after you.
yeah, you have the final
Elia?
word before we. Oh, go ahead, Elia.
Yeah, I would also like agree with Francis that there's a distinction whether you have the book completely available or whether you should teach it. I think in my case, she didn't really have to teach it, because if I compare it to other controversial books, like coming from Germany, we have a lot of controversial books, and especially when it comes, for example, to a history about the war crimes, the Holocaust, there is a consensus that some books don't have to be read, like you don't have to teach them, they're not even available. So I'm like, okay, why does this book, especially about African descent, has to be read? Although it's controversial, but there's a consensus that like books about the Holocaust don't need to be read. And also I have the feeling, especially then going to middle school and high school, everything about the Holocaust controversial books, they were not even touched. They were not touched. And I'm like, okay, so when it comes to stereotypes about Black people, why do you have to touch it? There are better books about it nowadays, which explain the past thinking and the new thinking. Just because when it comes to the history, because they're not people of color, that you have to mention it, or that you don't have to mention it. So yeah, this was for me. Like they can be available, but I don't think they have to be taught necessarily. They're a better option, especially concerning that it's getting more diverse.
But do you think it was a fault of the book or the teacher?
I think it's a teacher, but because you cannot control every teacher in the country, like you cannot step in any classroom and be like, oh no, this is wrong. You cannot. So I think in order to avoid the teacher's mistake, just don't read it in general. Have it available for those who want to read it. But if it's explicitly harmful in that way, don't use it.
Oh, I see. So what Elias, to summarize maybe what Elias saying, okay, you know, we can assume that all teachers will teach like Dr. Seuss in a critical way.
Yep.
Okay. And since we cannot make that assumption, maybe it's better to not teach those harmful books at all, like Dr. Seuss. Okay.
Well, let me just say a couple things. First of all, thanks to Francis and the others for making this distinction. I think it's a really important one. There is something different about the question of whether a book should be in a school library and whether it should be in a curriculum. Because in the latter case, you are, in a sense, mandating the book, right? If you have Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which used to be a standard bearer in English class in the curriculum, what you're saying is everyone, or close to everyone, has to read it. And that's different from it being in the library, for sure. But you know, I'm really glad that that the speaker mentioned the question of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism in Germany, because here too we have a great example of why we liberals get very, very worried when things like anti-Semitic speech are banned. You know what happened after October 7th? A whole bunch of Palestinians in Germany were arrested for violating the anti-Semitism laws. because somebody in Germany thought that saying things like "from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free," or globalize the Intifada were anti-Semitic. Now listen, depending on who's talking and who's listening, I may agree that they're anti-Semitic too. But this whole discussion is premised on the idea that there's some, I'm using a very loaded metaphor, mosaic tablet up in the sky that's called anti-Semitism. We all know what it is. Like pornography, we know it when we see it. So we get it by the tail and we pull. But that's not the way the world actually works. People are too different in their ideation, in their culture, in their background to have any sort of consensus on any of this stuff. And that's precisely why the default position always has to be speech and more of it, because we are not nearly as sure as we think about what's anti-Semitic or what's racist or what's transphobic. We throw those words around with such certainty when in fact we don't actually know. And that is the fundamental reason why we need freedom. Our method of knowing is communication and speech. You may think Seuss is racist. You may think From the River to the Sea is anti-Semitic. That's cool. You think that. All right? But I am not going to let your view of that matter be normative for everybody else. We can't have a discussion and we can't have education on those terms.
Go ahead, Philip. I think you want to say
Yeah,
something.
and for Aaliyah, I'm happy to send you. I've done some work on anti-racism in German children's literature. I published an article with my friend Ada Bieber. I'd be happy to send that to you if you're at all interested. Elodie Malanda is also doing really good work on that subject. And just to affirm what you're saying, Germany has been really good in addressing the crimes of the Holocaust and really bad at reckoning with its own colonialism, right? And I think your experience bears that out. And I want to try to address what Francis asked earlier, and I didn't write it all down, so a lot of it has now drifted slightly from my from my view here, which is not great. No, I'm
So
not.
it's basically books in the library versus books that teachers actually teach and highlight. That do you think
Right.
there's
Well, yeah,
different
and
roles?
I would agree with Jonathan there that there's a lot of echo somehow, but I would agree with Jonathan there. If you put it on the syllabus, you're endorsing it. But you're having everybody read it and buy it. Now you can do that and have people read it critically, which would be a reason for including it on the syllabus if it's a book that's perpetuating racist stereotypes. But yeah, there is a kind of endorsement. This is part of the curriculum if you put it on the syllabus versus just having it in the library. And yeah, I mean, I think when I come down to it, I think that the biggest difference between, or I perceive the biggest difference between Jonathan's position and mine has to do with power. I think that's the biggest difference, and that it's not equally distributed in the world or in classrooms. And I think that is where we differ. Or why
I don't believe power is equally distributed in the world. I'm a historian. There's no credible historian who does.
Well,
it can't.
But if you sort of argue that we need more speech, when some speech, I guess I find it puzzling that you say we don't know what is and isn't racist. Really? I mean, I can think of ambiguous examples, but I can't sort of say categorically, well, maybe it's racist, maybe he was just having a bad day, right? That's where I kind of go like, wait, what? So that's
Bill, is it racist to oppose affirmative action?
Well, see, now that is something that you could have a debate about, but I don't think you could have a debate about a racist caricature. That's a little hard to argue like this is dehumanizing. Oh,
yeah, right.
Okay,
I mean, we're not going to debate if a swastika is a symbol of hate, right?
Well, it's become a symbol of hate, yeah, and that I would say it's very hard to argue that's not a symbol of hate, even if it was once a symbol of peace, right?
Correct. And I would go further. I would say that some people who oppose affirmative action are absolutely racist, and I could show that to you quite clearly.
Well, sure, yeah.
Not everybody who does is.
Yeah, I mean it's an attempt to address the structural nature of racism. So I mean that's the argument for it, and well, that's the argument I would make for it. But I mean I could agree that debating that is kind of different than saying, well, if a white man uses the N-word, maybe he's just no, actually, there's kind of there's no way in which I can make that acceptable. There's a whole history of using that to dehumanize people that if it comes out of my mouth, that's what it's doing, even if I don't want it to, right? I can't exempt myself from that history. So
Okay, we have another student question. Okay, go ahead, Julia.
Hello. So for me, the main topic about all this is how we keep politicizing and criminalizing everything. Like there should be an extent to which you can have an opinion about something, and necessarily doesn't have to be always about making it wrong or right. Like, for example, I understand that I talk from a privileged position, but I also understand that there's, of course, different opinions on this. But for me, it's just it should be more like realistic than that. Like I think we keep making arguments that are just not realistic in some way. For example, like the argument about the trans in the Olympics, I just think there's biologically different. That's the argument. I don't think we should keep in depth about like difference about tolerance and like imposing a way of thought. Like I of course understand that there should be tolerance about every gender and everything, of course. But when it comes to genetics and biologically like differences, that should also be taken into account. And when it comes to like the books, I just keep like it's just like a whole thing that is just too debatable, and it should be more to the point, like educating people and or not. Like I don't know, just keeps coming up. So I think that should be also a point of separating politics and social issues to an extent, like making it like secular. And also like religion is also like an imposing of one thought. So if you make religion into the topic as well, it's just one like not one person, but like a whole ideology, like interpreting a text. That's also imposing a thought. So I also think religion should not be in the politics or in classrooms per se. So that's my thought.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Let me share some other student comments because students all wrote papers on this. Couple of students were from China and Hong Kong, and it was interesting how the authorities in Hong Kong use the same harm argument that certain movies and books are harmful, and so they either label them or ban them. And then it's also interesting how the government authorities in both South Korea and China, they actually invoke the Holocaust laws, saying like it's not the people in Europe, there are certain things you cannot say like Heil Hitler, and so why shouldn't people here in China, we can have similar laws that certain things are harmful, they should not be said. So it's really interesting about this kind of like certain discourses become really globalized. That's number one. Number two is Philip talked about kind of like Dr. Seuss's anti-Japanese caricatures back in World War II. And it's interesting because we have a lot of that ongoing here in Korea. We have a lot of anti-Japanese cartoons, movies, drama, anime. Some of the cartoons are even more explicit than what Dr. Seuss wrote. But it's interesting because, and you see the same phenomenon with Palestinians, right? Like a lot of Palestinian children's books have a lot of anti-Jewish caricature. But I think there's this notion that there's a difference between victims and oppressors. That like Koreans were victimized by Japan, Palestinians were victimized by Israel. So in a way, like strong like anti-Israel or anti-Japan caricatures can be a form of like kind of like independence and kind of like kind of going beyond their victimhood. Okay, and so I guess my question to Philip and Jonathan is that do you think it makes a difference if you are in terms of like caricatures of another group, if you happen to be members, if it comes from a victimized class or a victimized nation, like a formerly colonized nation, right? And so is it okay for people like say Namibia to have very strong anti-German or anti-white caricatures of their former colonizer, right? Okay. So that's it. So those were some student comments, and Jonathan or Philip, you're welcome to respond.
Look, I don't think it's, quote, okay to demean or caricature anybody. But I also don't think it's okay for political or educational authorities to try to lay down rules around that. You know, I think art is one of the most powerful ways that human beings have found to express themselves. And that's precisely why I want it to be free. Even when I find it offensive or anti-Semitic. We had a professor here at Penn that after October 7th drew these cartoons of Israelis drinking Palestinian blood. You might have seen that on the internet. I thought that was abhorrent, and I immediately went to my laptop to write a column defending him. Not defending the caricature, but defending his right to create it. Other people read it differently from me. I can't assume my reading of it is going to be or should be the modal or the normative one. That's up to each of us, or should be.
I want to give Philip the last word, but before we do so, can we have any other questions or comments from the audience before we give Philip the last word? This is your last chance.
I don't want to give Philip the last word. I think you should give that to somebody else.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I don't see any other question or comments from the audience. So Philip, you have the last word, and then we're close.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Jonathan on caricatures being harmful, you know, no matter who they're of. So I would agree with that. And then I think I would also partially agree with the notion of, well, maybe I'll just separate completely, and I'm not sure whether this agrees or doesn't agree, but it interests me, or I think it's very different when a colonized group speaks back. I think it's different to punch up, you know, rather than punch down. And so I haven't seen these caricatures. I don't know anything about them except what you've said. But I think the reason there's no such thing as reverse racism is because there'd be like an entire system you'd need to have in place, which, you know, favored, let's say, African people, you know, and subjugated white people, let's say, which just doesn't exist. So a racist joke is offensive. A joke that is punching back at the racist, I think that's actually potentially quite different. You know, I haven't seen the caricatures, so I don't know what they're like, but I don't see those as equivalent, because I don't see the two groups as operating from the same position in terms of their power in the world and their power historically. So that would be my answer. I don't think it should be the last word. So, but that's my answer.
Can I just say
That's
one
fine.
thing in response to what Phil said?
Jonathan gets the last
Oh,
word.
Yeah, this is just one point. My hope is that post October 7th, we could also just start to critique this binary between the oppressed and the oppressor, between punching up and punching down, the colonial and the anti-colonial. You look at the Middle East and trying to figure out who's who, it's pretty darn hard, right? I mean, you know, that place has been colonized by all kinds of people. And if you go backwards in time, conquered by all kinds of people. Who's indigenous to the Middle East, huh? Who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed? I think reasonable people disagree about that too, which is why I object to this sort of hollow binary that just assumes it's always we, right? We the good, right? We know who the oppressor is and who the oppressed is. No, we don't. We disagree about those categories.
Philip, just for the final clarification, we talked about the globalization of Holocaust laws. Do you support the German, like the anti-Holocaust laws, that certain books and certain forms of speech, such as Heil Hitler, is illegal? Do you think that is okay in that context?
I mean, I think memory laws can be misused. And I
Okay.
think they have been misused. Russia, as Timothy Snyder has pointed out, has turned the logic of those memory laws upside down to protect the feelings of the powerful rather than the vulnerable, right? I think when they're used to protect the vulnerable, that's different. And I think maybe I did differ with Jonathan on this point. I actually do think we can, talk about who historically has been oppressed, and who historically has been the oppressor. So I would say, yeah, that I think memory laws can be misapplied, but I think that's in the application rather than in the idea of protecting the vulnerable.
Okay, so the principle is still okay. Okay.
I agree with the principle. I recognize that, like any law, they can go awry, they can be misinterpreted, they can be misused. But that's my answer. Yeah, which doesn't have to be the last word, but but since you asked, that's my answer. Somebody else can have the last word. So
unless does anyone else want the last word? Philip, I guess yours it. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'd like to thank everybody for coming and participating. Okay, thank you so much. So Jonathan, Philip, it was great to have you, and thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.
yeah,
really
thanks
great
for having
talk.
us. And I hope everybody
appreciate
got
it.
something out of it, and
Yeah.
made
Yes.
the debate
yes.
continue. Made the debate continue.
Yes, I agree, and hopefully you can speak on this next year as well. I don't think this debate will ever, it's not going to end anytime soon. So we love to
Certainly
hear
not.
from you again
If
next
it
year.
does, I'm out of a job.
Yeah, okay, that's
Right.
right.
Good luck,
Okay,
everybody.
thank you guys.
Okay.
Bye bye.
care.
Have a good one.
Okay, everybody wave, wave for the audience. It's all going to be on YouTube. All right. Sua, do you want to say something or just say bye? Okay. All right. Okay, everyone's gone, right? Okay. Hello. Okay. Oh, the speakers are gone. Okay, I'm gonna log out. 종료. Yep, it's gonna be on YouTube. So I'm gonna stop recording.